A sovereign wealth fund is a government-owned investment fund often established with reserves or national savings. Through targeted investments, it can be used to diversify the economy and to generate wealth for the country and its citizens. A sovereign wealth fund can also be used to manage the value of the currency to achieve national development goals. It also enables the country to borrow at favorable interest rates. The disadvantage is that it can be open to abuse and corruption. Now, President Ramaphosa's announcement that the government is going to establish one took many by surprise. The main question being, where is the money going to come from?
Maybe it's one of those things where in theory you create it, but you don't have much funds in there until you actually get a windfall gain of some kind or the other. But I think South Africa is very far away from that. We're at the moment really in a very, very tight spot as far as our economy is concerned. Some critical decisions will now have to be made, and it's got nothing to do with a sovereign wealth fund. That doesn't make our life easier. We have to make decisions around energy. Government has to decide how is it actually going to cut spending, to reduce its deficit, and to contain this massive build-up in debt, bearing in mind that interest on debt is now the fastest growing item in the budgets.
Others are a little suspicious about the president's announcement too. Professor Chris Maligane from West University's School of Economics and Finance is a long-time proponent of a sovereign wealth fund.
If you are serious about the idea of the sovereign wealth fund, you would outline how the sovereign wealth fund will be capitalized. Even if you give a broad outline, for example, you need to mention that the mineral resources in the country, the state is going to have a certain stake, and revenues from that will be directed towards a sovereign wealth fund.
Maligane suspects that the president's announcement is aimed at neutralizing his detractors at the ruling party's National General Council in June.
By not giving content to the sovereign wealth fund as to on what basis it will be established, then he hollows out the content, and to me it appears like he wants to appeal to the ANC to say, I am implementing NASREC resolutions, because NASREC resolutions do state that there needs to be an establishment of a sovereign wealth fund, and there are complaints that he is not implementing NASREC resolutions. So by not giving content to the sovereign wealth fund, he could be politicking.
The president left it to the finance minister to flesh out the announcement in his budget speech next week. Bongene Mochoi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, for more on this story, I'm joined in studio by political analyst Khaya Sithole. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.
So, of course, many people have come out and dismissed the idea, saying it's merely a distraction to talk about a sovereign wealth fund. But assuming that efforts are really made in that direction, where in South Africa currently, given the lay of the land, where can we extract value that we could put into a sovereign wealth fund?
Look, I think the reality is that if you go and study sovereign wealth funds, you could simply say there's probably two sources of injections into sovereign wealth funds. Natural resources, natural endowments, that's where you'd say this is what we're going to do. We're going to earmark royalties and everything from our natural endowments into this particular sovereign wealth fund. And if that's not what you have, then it will have to come from capital resources. And that's when we're talking about, do you have a budget surplus on an ongoing basis that can then say this surplus is going to this particular fund. In the South African instance, both options quite simply do not work. And I think if you're talking about natural resources, we are probably 40 or 50 years too late in the conversation, because if you're looking at 4 or 5 decades, when South Africa, was very big in the commodity space, where we're the primary producers of a lot of the important minerals out there, then of course this idea could have gained traction. You could have simply said that perhaps there's a royalty regime that says that 10%, whatever the number is, of everything extracted from the South African land is then going into this particular fund. Then you could have set it up. That's what a lot of countries that have very good and very strong wealth funds have done. That is a bit too late for us now. So the alternative is, do we have sufficient budget surpluses in order for us to put money into this? Well, the answer is that we're running budget deficits, and we'll continue to do so for at least the next 10 years.
Exactly. And even if we were to seriously entertain having a sovereign wealth fund, I mean, where would we invest those monies? Because we do have already, institutions like the IDC, we have institutions like even the PIC and the DBSA, even though it's for Southern Africa, not just for South Africa. So, how would those institutions work together such that they're not duplicating and so on?
So the interesting thing about the existing institutions that we have that you've just mentioned is that most of them tend to pursue a dual mandate, which is the pursuit of economic profit and also some form of social developmental enterprise.
Yeah.
So, for example, the DBSA, even though they were talking nonsense a couple of weeks ago, when they say they're putting 3.5 billion rand into SAA, they said it's because it's a developmental finance thing. So obviously that was not the issue. But those institutions tend to pursue the dual mandate. What sovereign wealth funds tend to do is that they tend to have a unilateral focus on extracting the best possible returns, regardless of what the social, mandate is. So they don't focus on the dual mandate. They simply say, how do we get the best returns out there? So the difference would be that these existing institutions would probably still continue pursuing their dual mandate, while a sovereign wealth fund would be trying to get the best returns out of that. Now, that would mean that in some instances they'll be cannibalizing each other. So there might be a project that the DBSA in particular is interested in, but then somebody says, well, if you take this project, it would mean that the sovereign wealth fund, which could have taken this project and demanded more and extracted more out of it, is not in a position to do so. So there might be some contestations, but I think in the South African context, because we're not going to get there in the first place, it's really just one of those nice conversations to have, but nothing of substance is going to come out of this.
Who do you think advises the president? Because, no, but on a serious note, given what you say and the analysis that you've given us, why would he make such a statement, given that he knows that the country is in such dire straits? We have massive social problems, and we shouldn't be putting things on the table that we know aren't even going to begin to work.
Look, I think this idea of selling dreams is obviously what a lot of politicians do by instinct. But in some cases, you would have thought that somebody would have read the speech and said, well, President, even the most basic and the most elementary questions in relation to this cannot be answered. So in some cases, you can put something on the table and people will say, yeah, even if the first 2 or 3 questions cannot be answered, there are 3 or 4 questions that you can cogently put together and say yes. In relation to the sovereign wealth fund, absolutely any question that you can ask, the government cannot answer in the affirmative, because quite simply the conditions do not exist. We just don't have the money for it. We do not have the appetite to even revisit how we're dealing with our natural resources and how people are mining and extracting things out of this country to say we're going to do things differently. So you do have to question the quality of the advice that the president gets, until of course you look beyond what really underpin the question of a state bank and the question of a sovereign wealth fund. It's the same thing that underpin the question of the land leading up to Nasrec and thereafter. And the reality is that the EFF becomes more vocal about these things, and when they become more vocal about it, and these things are very good to sell. So of course, as soon as you say this, people think, oh, so if we had such a thing, these are all the positive benefits, so therefore why don't we have it? When people talk about a state bank, they seem to be living under this illusion that a state bank would then simply say, how much interest rate do you want? If you want 1%, then I'll give you credit at 1%. So it's easy to sell these things to people until you ask them to actually put it together on paper and say, how would it work? So I think in most instances, it's a question of, do you want the EFF to stop talking about it? Then put it on your speech, President. Now, unfortunately, we have to interrogate the speech on its quality. And unfortunately, in relation to those 2 things, he shouldn't have said this. He was lying, and he knows about it.
Khaya, in terms of a state bank, how does it work? We know that with commercial banks, they're funded by depositors, and then they go on to make money by lending money to people. But with a state bank, how would it be capitalized? And presumably, at the end of the day, when it becomes fully functioning, it would still be going to market and getting money at the wholesale level at the same price as everybody else.
Oh, that's a great difficulty, in that no one in government can explain to you exactly what this concept of a state bank is. Are they simply saying that, look, we want to have some form of ownership, some significant ownership in a financing institution, so therefore we've decided to set up our own? If that is the issue, then of course we know that all that's going to change is that government is going to have a strong ownership in a particular institution, and then the rest of the issues are going to remain the same. Now, if you are then saying that you want a state bank because you want it to operate differently, we then have to interrogate exactly what is it that is going to do differently. Is it now going to, for example, sacrifice the spread on the deposits versus, the money, the savings margins? For example, if I go to the bank and then I put 100 rand there, and then they give me 2% as an interest, and then they lend it to you at 5%, are we now saying that the state bank should not be pursuing that wide margin, narrow that margin? Does that then make it easy for people to lend from this bank? Nobody can explain to what it is that they're trying to achieve. And then the secondary question is, of all the existing institutions that the state already controls, whether it is the IDC, whether it's the Land Bank, DBSA, or even the Post Bank, should it ever materialize, what is it that you cannot achieve using those institutions that you want to be able to achieve using this thing called a state bank? Again, the government refuses to explain exactly what it is that they're trying to put out there. But if you see some people want this thing, they want to be able to say the state owns a bank, but the state has a very poor track record of running anything that it controls. Imagine if you now give them access to something that simply says, here's money. I'd be very skeptical.
Khaya, we're going to leave it there. I have more to ask you, but we have to bring it to an end. That was Khaya Sithole. He's a political analyst. Critics have slammed